Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick.
I'm Ian.
Today we're talking about some great third albums. There's a bunch of links down below. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give us a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time we release new episodes. So I wanted to look at third albums because, you know, I think the first two albums in particular in a band's discography always get a lot of love.
Or hate.
That's
they're
true.
The focus, anyway.
Yeah. But I think by the third album, I think you can really generally tell the direction of a band and whether or not they're going to like fall off a cliff or if they're heading into, you know, this great trajectory across their career. So that's why I kind of wanted to look at...
Most of the time. I can think of one band where it took them a couple more albums.
Pink Floyd.
To fall off the cliff?
Oh, I was thinking Pink Floyd, you know, reach greatness with like their 8th album. But,
right. And well, I was thinking Motley Crue because they made it like their 5th album before they just...
That's true. And, you know, that happened. I think Motley Crue's trajectory was for a different reason, but...
Yeah,
you know,
because music's not that great.
Yeah, but I think for the most part, you can see where a band is going by their third album.
Right.
So I'm sure with this first one, some people will probably be scratching their head, and
especially just based on what we just talked about, because they didn't go. There was no cliff, they went over the cliff.
That's true. So Nirvana's album In Utero. I know there's probably a lot of people out there that are thinking to themselves that is not a third album.
It's a last album.
It's a fourth album. But it's not, because Incesticide is technically a compilation album. So the Bleach,
right?
Then Nevermind, and then technically In Utero is their third album. I would argue that this is their best album also. You know,
it's not a hard argument to make, I think, honestly.
I think there was a progression from Nevermind to In Utero. And that's the thing that with this album that's always made me kind of question where Nirvana would have gone after this album had Kurt Cobain not died. And it would have been interesting because I think, like I said, their music definitely changed from these two albums. And I think they're going to go in a different direction, maybe a little bit musically than what they were known for with Bleach and Nevermind. But I guess obviously we'll never know that.
But I agree. I think there were glimmers of not improvement, but maturity in this album. That I think if there had been, you know, a fourth and a fifth and a sixth album, you would have seen that progression advance.
I think there was a little bit of experimentation on this album that they didn't necessarily have earlier in their career.
Yeah, I agree. So one of my favorite third albums, and I would argue that it skyrocketed the band, is Alice Cooper's Love It to Death. So they had released 2 albums before this on Frank Zappa's label, and it was Pretty For You and Easy Action, which I love those albums. I think they're wholly underrated albums. But they started recording this.
This is a very different album.
Yeah, they started recording this still under Frank Zappa's label, more or less. But Bob Ezrin came in as a producer and really tightened up the musicality of the band, really kind of toned down the experimentation to make it more cohesive, because that would be the only argument you have for those other 2 albums. They're just not cohesive.
Yeah.
But it also allowed the band to basically get a good record deal with Warner Brothers. Or good, I mean, as relative, of course. But it's because of this album that Alice Cooper skyrocketed to stardom. And, you know, based on what we're looking at for a third album, this is a perfect example of that. Yeah,
absolutely. Another great third album that actually you didn't even think this was a third album until we started talking about it. But that is Dookie by Green Day. You know, it's so. What was their first? 39 Smooth was their first album.
Yeah, I always thought their first album was a compilation of singles and EPs, which there are some.
There's the album 1039 Smoothed Out Slappy Hours is a compilation of that first album and 2 EPs. So I think it's where some people kind of
that's where it was always confusing for me, because obviously when I got it for the first time when you were listening to it, it was a CD, so it had everything. Yeah. And when they released it on vinyl, they released it as its original, but they put the singles into the packaging as well. So it was essentially the same thing. I just always.
But if you look at the cover of it says 39 Smooth on it.
Right.
Yeah. So that album you had Kerplunk and then Dookie. Of course, Dookie It's the highest selling punk album of all time. Sold 25 million copies. It was everywhere. It was the album that put punk into the mainstream. I can't say enough about this album. It was influenced, its influence on me, and of course influence on mainstream music.
So my next one's kind of a more recent one, and it's Meliora by Ghost. Really not a lot to say. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it? I think so.
I think
that's how it's spelled.
I always say Meliora.
Meloria. I don't know.
It's a great album.
It's a great album, and there's a situation where the first album is great, but it was an independent album and then picked up on the label. Their second album, which was the main label album, I actually don't like as much as I like their first album.
Which was their second album? Was
Infestus?
That one. Yeah. I agree.
Which is a good album, but it's just not. I don't think it compares to the first album, and I don't think it compares to this one. And I would say that as far as like going forward, this doesn't necessarily define Ghost because it's a little bit harder edged than the stuff that came after it. Yeah. But as a third album from an artist that really kind of took a long time to get really super popular. I had heard of Ghost, but it wasn't like they are now. They're huge now. For a band like that to release this album at that point, it says a lot, and it's impressive where they've come from that.
Yeah. I'll say that I came into Ghost with Impera.
Yeah.
And then going back through their albums after that, I was really impressed with Meliora the first time I heard it. It's probably my favorite album of the band's. So I guess so far all my picks have been kind of questionable because this next one kind of is also because a lot of people consider this the band's fourth album, but technically it's only their third.
For similar reasons to the Green Day thing?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and that is Enema of the State by Blink-182. Their first album, Buddha, is not technically a studio album. It's a demos album. So, but people do classify that as an album. Some of the band members do also, but like I said, technically it's not. So this is the album that really made, Blink-182 was big when with Dude Ranch. Of course, this is the album that made them, one of the biggest bands in the world. They were all over MTV. They were on TRL every day. My wife at the time, we were just dating. She was my girlfriend, but she was big into like boy bands and stuff like that. She even had the CD. Like everyone listened to the CD. It was huge. You couldn't get away from this album.
And Blink had songs on movie soundtracks and everything.
Yeah, and this is the album that really, I think it changed. Dookie changed or brought punk music into the mainstream. This is the album that I think changed mainstream punk music into the early 2000s.
So my next one is, there's a lot I could say about this. I don't have time, but Counting Crows, This Desert Life. It is so far removed from what it had come before it.
And it really is.
Yet it was still, distinctly Counting Crows. Again, I've said in other videos how Recovering the Satellites really kind of solidified them as a band for me because it showed that they weren't just August and Everything After and copying that. Yeah. And this just continues that trend because again, it's so far removed. What draws me to this album a lot of times is Counting Crows from the beginning had a really good contract. They got lucky with their record contracts, but they still had studio or label telling
influence.
telling them they needed to have a single. You have to have singles. They wanted Mrs. Potter's Lullaby to be a single. It's an 8-minute song, and Adam Duritz, knowing full well that could be a good hit single to move them forward and get them radio play and MTV play, said sure, but I'm not cutting the song.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to do a radio edit of it. He said, no, not doing it. And for what it's worth, this album didn't sell as well as some of their other albums, their first two albums. And you could argue that he made that choice to his own detriment. But the integrity that it takes to do that, a lot of artists do that. There's a lot of artists that don't.
Yeah.
So this album stands out for me for that reason. It just the integrity of the band. Plus, it did have some big hit singles. Colorblind was used in the movie Cruel Intentions, and so that had a huge radio hit or radio presence. Plus, I really like the album cover.
There was an interesting progression musically from their first album to this one, and It's one that I didn't really like the first couple of times I listened to it. I mean, there's a couple of good tracks on it, but it's really kind of grown on me since then.
Yeah, and for me, I've never had a Counting Crows album. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's one Counting Crows album that really had to grow on me, but that was much later. This was just when Recovering the Satellites came out. It was an instant hit for me. I loved every track. This was no different.
Yeah.
But if I'm ranking them, obviously I would put some of those other albums ahead of this. But it's still, as a third album, it's fantastic.
Really good. So I might get a little pushback for this last one because I think it's probably their best album, and that is Master Puppets by Metallica. I will say that the Black Album was the album that really got me into Metallica, and for the longest time I really considered it like the peak of their career. But I think the more I went back and listened to this album and Ride the Lightning, I found a new appreciation for the band. And I'd say for probably most of the last 10 years, this has been my favorite album from Metallica. I think they tried to recapture and best this on Injustice for All and the Black Album, and it was never really the same as what they did on this album.
Well, I think those two albums were them trying to experiment too. They were doing different things, especially when it came to the Black Album. But this was kind of the end of an era too for them. It was, because I think this is the last album Cliff played on.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of a time capsule for what Metallica was in the early 80s. And then everything going forward is a new version of Metallica. Yeah. And it shows in their music. Not to say that any of it's bad, but you can almost kind of break Metallica down by like three eras. You've got the Cliff Burton eras, you got the Jason Newsted era, and then you got the new guy. I can't remember his name. He's a new guy. He's been there for like 15 years.
15 years. What's his last name? It's Robert Trujillo. I don't know why I couldn't think of his
so
name.
you can break it down by those eras: the Cliff Burton era, the Jason Newsted era, and the Robert Trujillo era. This is obviously the best of the Cliff Burton era. Black Album arguably being the best of the Jason Newsted era, and then I don't know. We could go back and forth on what's actually the best of the newest era.
Well, that's all we got for today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop a comment down below. Let us know what some of your favorite third albums are. There's so many great ones out there. But love to know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, give us a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all we got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.